all the things that we're talking about. So without any further ado, if you would silence your cell phones and, oh, wait, no, you're not actually here. You don't have to silence your cell phones at all. In fact, tell everybody, call on your cell phone, tell everybody to come. This is our seventh Quarantunes concert. And it's a benefit concert and all of them have been benefit concerts for COVID-19 victims and their families and jobs and food and money and all that kind of stuff. You know, everybody knows somebody who's suffering from this, and so we're raising a bunch of money. We've raised, I don't know, it's like $10,000, something like that. And so it's going directly to 100% of it goes to a good cause, and so we're getting it right out to the folks. So if you want to donate, that's awesome. If you want to listen, that's awesome. If you want to donate and listen, that's terrific. So I'm taking requests. Just kidding. A lot of people think ragtime was the beginning of jazz. Most people think it's pre-jazz, because if you think about the things that make jazz jazz, ragtime didn't have them. It wasn't syncopated. It was syncopated, but it wasn't swung. It was straight eighth, as opposed to like that. So it wasn't swung, and it was not improvised, certainly at first. Scott Joplin's influences from Europe, not from Africa and South America and Central America and all of those kinds of places, and France and so forth. It was mostly, sort of classical music, all written out, no spots for improvisation. Later on, everybody improvised over a ragtime style, in a ragtime style over ragtime changes. But initially, and you remember that Scott Joplin died in 1917, so it's just 2 years after we're going to start with the history of jazz. I would call Scott Joplin to be the pre-history of jazz. I think jazz started with a man that everyone realizes Louis Armstrong is... He's on the Mount Olympus of jazz. He is the first one to swing. He was the first one to do a lot of things, and his career was long and storied. He played with everybody, made tons of records, went everywhere, traveled everywhere, played with everybody, and everybody played with him over a long, long period of time. And he was really the foundation of jazz, and the city of the foundation of jazz was New Orleans. We could tell you a lot about that, about Jelly Roll Morton and all of that kind of stuff, and swing, and the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which recorded their first, their first record was in 1917. And oddly enough, the jazz band, which was spelled J-A-S-S at the time, the jazz band was all white musicians, which was very unusual. Everything was very segregated back then, but make no mistake about it, jazz is an art that began with the Negro spirituals, and we could have an entire concert for just that. But it's a black art. It's an art that blacks played and that blacks developed, and all through the history of jazz, you will see black artists, and we'll talk about a lot of those today. So then you get into jazz, and you get into the jazz age, you get into Prohibition in 1920, and you get into the beginnings of the Great American Songbook with Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern and a very young George Gershwin and Richard Rodgers, popular theater songs, lots and lots of things like that. And then Louis Armstrong in 1931 recorded this piece. It turned out to be his theme song. It's a song called He Sang It, I Would Never Even Attempt to Sound Like Louis Armstrong. So we'll just play the instrumental version of When It's Sleepy Time Down South. 2, 3, 4.
Hello, my name is Aiden Plank. Tom introduced me a minute ago, but I just wanted to say hello again. Thanks for joining us. In our brief history now of jazz music that we're flying through, we are now approaching and in the 1930s. This is an era where jazz is incredibly popular, maybe for the first time and maybe for the last time. It was a kind of America's popular music. We're coming out of or into world wars, a very kind of patriotic moment in our country, and the sound of the country is the big band sound. A big band is a large ensemble in the jazz world. It encompasses trumpets, trombones, saxophones, and a rhythm section of piano, bass, drums, sometimes guitar, and a lot of these names you will know very well, like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Cab Calloway, Fletcher Henderson, Benny Goodman, the Dorsey Brothers, and many others. The really important thing about this moment, though, is that this is an era where all of a sudden swing is established as the utter norm of jazz, as Tom mentioned, coming out of Louis Armstrong's innovations. And again, it's very popular. So we're going to play two tunes from my favorite composer, Duke Ellington. The first is actually not written by Duke. It's his theme song. It was written by his collaborator, Billy Strayhorn, who was from Pittsburgh, just down the road here. And this was a tune that Billy Strayhorn brought to the band in about 1939 when he was hired by Duke. And it was his theme song called Take the A Train. I did want to hopefully get through another tune of Duke's called Sophisticated Lady, which was a feature that you would hear the Barry player Harry Carney play in the band. And the reason I wanted to play this is because this one, Sophisticated Lady, was actually composed by Duke, and so much of what you know of Duke Ellington is his innovations as a composer, a great American composer.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
If we played all the way through all these tunes, this would be a 2-hour show instead of a 1-hour show. So we're just going to give you the head and maybe play a little bit and just go on to the next thing because there's so much. Aiden alluded to this, that we are leaving out 100 times more than we're actually saying or referring to. There's a million more composers, a million more songs, a million more cities and history and all that stuff. So it's we're just going to just a little flavor. I have a funny story about Sophisticated Lady. While Aiden's doing his thing over there, my brother Dred is a pianist in New York City. His band comes about once a year, and we play Nighttown. And for some reason, he wants me to sing. And so I say to him, okay, well, whatever you want, the band can play, and I'll sing. So what do you want me to sing? So one year he said, I want you to sing Sophisticated Lady. And I went, you realize that Sophisticated Lady is an instrumental tune. It's really, it's really, really hard to sing. It wasn't written as a singer's song. He said, oh, I know, but there's lyrics, and you could sing it. All right, fine. So we sang it, and I got all the way through, and it was fine. And he said, well, that was great. He said, you know why I asked you to do that, don't you? I said, no, I don't. He said, well, I've sung it with about 100 singers, and nobody has sung that tune right yet. He said, and I figured you had the best shot at it. It's a true story. I think I got close. I don't know. Who knows? We going to talk about bop? Yeah.
Okay, so big bands became very hard to fund, basically. It's a lot of musicians, and it's still hard to pay a lot of musicians. And some innovations took place in the jazz world, predominantly by a core group of musicians. I will name their names. One was Charlie Parker. The others are Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, a great Cleveland musician named Tad Dameron. And the music became known as bop or bebop. And this was music that was challenging to play. It was harmonically sophisticated, it was rhythmically sophisticated, and it wasn't music that just anybody could play. The swing era was so popular that big bands were ubiquitous. They were everywhere, and some of them were fantastic and some of them weren't. And so when bebop emerged, you had a new standard of playing this music that required a lot more training and skill, I would say, and study. So the music is oftentimes faster, the melodies are adventurous, and if you couldn't hang with those musicians, it was really clear, and you weren't really welcomed back to try to play with them again. So, but it's actually really beautiful and joyful music too, and so it's fun to play. So this is another one.
I don't know if this is a true story or not, but it's a story that goes around with Dizzy and Bird that, they were playing, I think, Whispering or something like that, and they were playing a tune, and of course they were kind of popular, and people would come and want to play with them. So cats would bring, there would be more musicians in the crowd than there were actually paying customers. And they would come up on the stand, and they'd want to play so they could say, I played with Charlie Parker, I played with Dizzy Gillespie, Well, this got tired and real old, and so they decided, well, we're going to take the tempo up a little bit and see who can hang with us. And some people say that that's how bebop was born, is that everything was at a lightning pace, and little by little, cats would just leave the stand and pack up their instrument and go home. And finally, the only people left in the place were the guys who could really play, and that's what they wanted anyway. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's one of the legends of jazz, shall we say. This is a great Charlie Parker tune called Yardbird Suite. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so forth. This could go on many, many choruses of this. what we do is we have something that musicians call chord changes or just changes. You say, man, you know the changes to that tune? In other words, you know how the song goes, and can you play over the chord changes? Because what musicians do in the jazz genre is not just make things up. A lot of people think, oh, you just make stuff up. Well, I suppose improvisation has a little bit of that in it, but it is really a lot more structured than people think. We are going over, Aiden and I are playing more or less the exact same chord changes. I hope you can tell that we're playing the same chord changes. And that means that I have to play, and when Aiden takes a solo or when anybody takes a solo, they have to play within the confines of that set of chord changes. There's a lot of complicated chord changes. There's substitutions for chord changes. There's all kinds of things going on. But fundamentally, you sort of have to be in the same key. You have to be at the same harmonies and all that sort of thing. So it's really that sort of thing. Well, Dizzy Gillespie had a really great idea. He had a big band, like as Aiden was saying, everybody had big bands practically. Your mother had a big band, everybody had a big band, right? And some of them were great and some of them were not so great. Well, Dizzy's band, as you can imagine, was a terrific band. He was in New York, and he decided that it would be a great idea if he had a Cuban rhythm section, kept the regular band, 5 trumpets, 4 bones, 5 saxes, and a Cuban rhythm section, okay, a Latin rhythm section. And it was amazing. The sound was incredible, and it started an entire revolution of music. And so we want to play a song from that era. It's by Mario Bauza, and we're talking about now I would say 1953. Yeah, 1953 or so, that Mambo In was written. And so imagine this with a band, with a regular big band, but with a Cuban rhythm section. The thing that made it really interesting were these. I happen to have 2 clave here, and the clave was what kept the beat. There are 2 kinds of clave. It's not complicated. 3 plus 2 or 2 plus 3. The 2 plus 3 goes like this. And the 3 plus 2 is, of course, exactly the opposite of that. This Mambo In happens to be a 2 plus 3 sort of clave, and so you can kind of clap that as we're playing. One of the other really unusual things about this music is that the bass player, who heretofore has always been playing on 1, on the downbeat, so you know where the downbeat was, is not playing on 1 anymore. He's playing on the end of 4. So there's no actual downbeat happening with the rhythm section. And the piano player is not playing his normal, what they call comping or complementing behind a solo. They're just playing that kind of stuff. No. In this music, it's a very interesting rhythmic pattern called a montuno. Okay? So we're going to play a little bit of that. Aiden is going to play the typical Latin bass, and I'm going to play the typical Latin montuno to this tune by Mario Bauza called Mambo In. And we'll just play a little bit of the tune, just this part of it, just the part that is the interesting bass who doesn't play on 1, on the downbeat, and this montuno in the piano part. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, pretty interesting stuff. Now imagine that with a whole band. You've got all kinds of percussion, and you've got a band playing, and it's unbelievable. If you are not familiar with this style of music, this mambo and this stuff that came from Cuba and from Latin America, it's unbelievably fun to play. Anyway, I will sing the melody to Mambo In while we're playing all of this other stuff, and we'll see what happens. Here we go. 1, 2, ba 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 da 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 ba da 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 dum bum ba da da da. bum bum ba da ba ba. Bum bum ba ba bum bum ba da ba da. Ba bum bum ba bum ba da ba bum bum ba 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 bum bum ba bum ba da ba da bum do da bum bum ba ba bum bum ba da ba da bum bum ba ba bum bum ba da da da. And so forth. Again, we could go on and on and on with this stuff, but we'll be here all night. Great. Great. So we went from this kind of very exciting mambo in this very dramatic and lovely, highly rhythmic stuff. And then later on, in what we would call the cool school, which happened in the 50s. All right, so from a historical standpoint, Aidan pointed out that the big bands were very popular in the 30s and 40s. Was popular music. You turn on the radio and you would hear Stan Kenton, you'd hear Count Basie, you'd hear Duke Ellington, you'd hear all these great bands, right? And it was the popular music. And people danced to this music. They danced to it, all right? So that was a big thing. If you couldn't play dance music, well, you wouldn't get hired, right? And Duke Ellington has, he's written an entire book about it. It's called Music is My Mistress. And he talks about, how, he would play some of his innovative, pieces, and people would be like, you can't dance to that. Can you play Take the A Train? We can dance to that. So he knew, which gigs were the dance gigs and which gigs were the concert gigs, right? So a lot of that happened in the big band era were super popular, okay? So the exact opposite of that, the bebop era, and then the hard bop era after that, okay, was not that. It was not commercial. It was not dance music. It was none of the things that big band was. All right, so then you get in the middle of bebop, and then you hear all this frantic playing from, like Charlie Parker is one of the most amazing, if not the most amazing saxophone player of all time, right? Incredible technique, incredible ideas, wrote a lot of music, played in bands, was, a whole generation of saxophone players after that wanted to play like Charlie Parker. So naturally, there was going to be a reaction to that, to this frantic, lots of chord changes, lots of notes, lots of energy kind of music. Leave it to the folks on the West Coast, because from the West Coast came exactly that, the exact opposite of the bebop school, and that was like what they called the cool school. It wasn't hot, music was hot. You remember the tune? It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Give that rhythm everything you've got. Sweet would be like Sophisticated Lady, Sleepy Time Down South. Hot would be Yardbird Suite, Mambo Inn, stuff like that, okay? Well, the people in the West Coast, they said, we want to play the sweet music. We want to play the cool music, right? And these were people like Dave Brubeck and Chet Baker and people like, yes, believe it or not, that was also part of the cool school. When this music came out, okay, part of the reaction to that was like you would call it bossa nova, which is a different kind of Latin music, right? Bossa nova. It also used the clave, but in a very different way. It was much more laid back. It was much more relaxed. Everybody knows "Girl from Ipanema" by Antonio Carlos Jobim, right? But we'd like to do a tune by Jobim that is maybe not as popular. He was a very well-known musician at his time. He was had a classical background, and this next song is actually taken from a Chopin prelude in E minor, and he does obviously something different with it. But if you happen to know that piece, all you piano players out there, you'll hear the echoes of that in this piece called "How Insensitive." I'm going to play through it 2 times. The first time with just bass and the melody, so you can hear how sparse it is. And then we'll go the second time, and I'll add some harmonies, and you'll have a little different feel for it. This is Antonio Carlos Jobim, How Insensitive. How Insensitive. Part of this cool school was a pianist who I grew up with, Dave Brubeck. Dave Brubeck was a West Coast cat, very unusual. It was a Roman Catholic, had a bunch of kids, didn't take drugs, didn't smoke, didn't drink, but had the most famous quartet from the 1950s called the Dave Brubeck Quartet. And this next song, which was actually written, another sort of Billy Strayhorn, Duke Ellington story, right? This is actually, everybody thinks Dave Brubeck wrote this because the Brubeck Quartet made it famous, but in fact, Paul Desmond, their saxophone player, wrote this next tune, a tune called Take 5. Now, up until now, jazz had been mostly in 4/4. Occasionally in 3/4, you'd have a jazz waltz. Occasionally, like a lot of my favorite things was this thing that jazz players played a lot. It was in 3/4, but most things were in 4, and they swung in 4. Well, Brubeck thought, well, what about all these other things? He studied with Darius Milhaud, a famous composer, and what about all these other time signatures that other than 4/4? So Paul Desmond came into the studio one day with this, and it was called Take 5 because it was in 5/4, which is the same as 4/4 if you have a limp. I think pretty much, if you just have a limp, 5/4 would be perfect for that, all right? So we'll play a little bit of that. Take 5. 1, 2, 3. 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, he didn't stop with Take 5. He had many, many songs that were in very unusual time signatures, oftentimes time signatures from other countries. This next song is a perfect example of it. It's a tune called Blue Rondo a la Turk, which he heard in the East, and he heard these rhythms and he heard these musicians playing them. Actually, Aiden, I had an experience like that with a bunch of musicians that, from the Middle East. And they were playing all this music, and it was a bunch of old guys, and they were paying no attention to what they were doing. It was one of those outdoor festivals in the summer, right? And they were paying no attention. They were just playing this music, and I'm like, this is amazing. What are they doing? Well, they were playing in 15/16 time, except I don't even know that they realized it because it was so effortless. It was so part of their culture. It was just so natural. And me and a bunch of musicians were out there trying to count, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 50. No, they can't be in 15/16. That's ridiculous. Nobody plays in that. Well, they did, and it was amazing, incredible. So influences from all over the world, really. And so this particular tune is a perfect example of that. It's called, we'll just play just a little bit of it. It's called Blue Rondo a la Turk. It is in 9/8, but it's not in a normal 9/8. It is 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3. Does that add up to 9? Okay. 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3 goes like this. It goes on like that for a really long time, but we'll just play that enough for now. Okay, Blue Rondo a la Turk. So Dave Brubeck, when Take 5 came out, actually his Time Out, and then his second record, of course, Time Further Out, but his Time Out sold more than 1 million records, and at that point, in spite of the fact that it was coming in the 50s, long after when we started tonight at 7 o'clock, we started at 1915, right? So from 1915, think of all the records that were made, and through the big band era and all of that, and all the famous musicians, all the popular bands, this sold more records than any other jazz record in history up to that time. This Dave Brubeck and this strange multi-time signature thing.
So we're now in an era where we could kind of define jazz as diversity, really. Jazz becomes a music that is, for one thing, inclusive. It embraces all different cultures and people and beliefs. That's one of my favorite things about jazz, of course. But another thing that's so staggering about jazz is jazz actually really encourages new ideas. It's a music that you don't have to reject what happened before. You can still love and appreciate that, but you can also look forward too and try out new ideas, and that's welcome and very encouraged in this music. So Tom was discussing how amazing it was to have a jazz tune in 5/4. What I can tell you is now, it's actually, we're moving a little bit beyond this at this point in jazz. But throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, it was like that was the thing, playing anything in an odd meter, in 5 and 7 and 11 and 13, just odd meter all over the place, playing standards in odd meters. And so it's really interesting to me to see later on a seed that was planted earlier in the music kind of germinate and become this very popular trend. So I certainly love Dave Brubeck too, and that's a big reason. But Tom asked me to discuss just a little bit with you a few people that we kind of equate with modern jazz playing, or kind of the beginnings of a kind of modern approach to the music. I don't really like that term so much because all of these musicians we've discussed, when they were doing their thing, it was completely modern, completely contemporary, completely innovative, and just staggeringly amazing. But we give so much credit to two musicians, and it's certainly worthy of that credit. One is Miles Davis, who actually had some involvement with what was coined the cool jazz movement. He did an album called Birth of the Cool, for example. And the other musician is John Coltrane. Both Miles Davis and John Coltrane kind of came up in the tutoring of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, the bebop school. They interacted with those musicians. Miles, in fact, took Dizzy Gillespie's place in Charlie Parker's band for a period of time. And we know that John Coltrane played in Dizzy Gillespie's big band and certainly was around that. But both these musicians became really big innovators. And especially with Miles Davis, it's hard to just sum up his innovation in one particular thing. The exact same goes with John Coltrane. But we're going to talk about or play for you two things. One is a piece by John Coltrane called Naima. Naima was John Coltrane's first wife. It's a beautiful kind of ballad, but it plays on what we call a pedal point. So the bass just basically plays two notes. That's not why I picked this piece. But the harmony moves around that, and that's something that you'll hear, this pedal point. I'm playing an E flat, and then later I play a B flat, and what you hear in the piano is this motion of these chords, this harmony moving around that pedal point. So that's a really amazing thing. And then the other thing we're going to play is a Herbie Hancock tune called Maiden Voyage, and another Miles tune called So What. Both of these are equated with the modal approach to playing. We talked about the complexity of bebop. We talked about how bebop utilized so much intense harmony, and it was difficult music to play. As Tom was talking about, there are changes to tune, chord changes to tunes. In fact, there were many changes to all these tunes, and the modal approach kind of gets rid of all of those changes, and you have longer improvisations that focus around what we call modes of a scale. So if you have any music theory in you, you can play like a C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and you can start that scale on another degree of the scale. So if I started on D, it's basically the same notes as C major, but you get what we call Dorian, or the Dorian mode, which is a minor sound. And so this approach kind of takes a broader look at harmony, and there's a lot more space to develop ideas, and you kind of get a better taste of the certain modes and sounds that you're working with. So I think we're going to start with Naima. Again, John Coltrane was so wonderful. Later in his life, he embraced a very spiritual path. His music becomes an intense expression of his spirituality, and it becomes, to some people, very chaotic, and to some of us, very beautiful. That's up to you to decide, really, for yourself. But I think you'll all like Naima quite a lot.
2, 3, 4.
Thank
Okay, what Aiden played his last note, that is called a suspension. And you notice it doesn't resolve in this music. Okay? It doesn't resolve. In the big band era, even in the bop era, it would go, or, but in this case, and it just stays that way. And there's a certain kind of floating nature to that music, a certain kind of unfinished nature to it. We'd like to go on and actually do that Miles Davis tune you're talking about. This is kind of an unusual tune. It has it's well known, but it only has 2 chord changes in it. And I was just reading about this, that Miles was at a point in his life where, and this is a guy who had, as Aiden said, I'd played the bebop stuff, I played the hard bop stuff, he'd played all that stuff. He had tons of technique, he was a great player, and he could play a million changes with no trouble at all. For him to go from, Scrap 'Em in the Apple and Donna Lee to So What, which only had 2 chords in it, is really a testament to his growth and change and ability to march out in front, which is something Miles did his entire life as a musician. When they went into the studio, Miles only wrote down 2 chords, a D minor chord and an E flat minor 7. That's it. That was the tune. There was no song. There was no form. There was nothing. He just said, okay, here we go. Turn on the tape. Let's go. And this is what turned into So What? You see why it's so fun to play that music, because it's very wide open, and you can use a lot of ideas that are, we call, in jazz, like everything else, there's lots of jargon. And one of the things we talk about is inside and outside. And when you play inside, you're playing all the right chord changes, and you're playing, you're playing all the regular chord changes, you're playing all the notes that go in those chord changes, and it's very straightforward. And in fact, that was one of the things that the bebop era kind of was rebelling against. You know, they were tired of inside, and they wanted to play outside. Now, outside went to outside, went to outside, and finally we got to free jazz, which was in some ways completely outside. The free jazz people said, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the free jazz people, you know, it was sort of like the second Viennese school with Webern and Schoenberg and Berg. You know, tonality had gone as far as it could possibly go, so it had no more function anymore. So in jazz, free jazz was that thing. It was not changes necessarily, or if the changes didn't make the kind of harmonic or tonal sense, there wasn't always a tonal center. There was people could play different things at the same time. They could play in different keys, different time signatures. It was very, very free. And for jazz, a lot of jazz musicians thought, that's cool. We really like that. That's what we like about jazz, is that it's free. I get a chance to be free. I get a chance to express myself the way I want to. And for some people, that free jazz was a way to do that. We're going to end, gosh, what time is it? 7:54. I think we're going to make it. 60 years of jazz in 60 minutes. So, as we said at the top of the show, so to speak, we left out so much music and so many really important players and important cities and we left out 99% of the history of jazz. We left it out. This was kind of like Jazz 101. We're going to just take you through it real quickly. So I hope it was entertaining. I hope it was educational. I hope it was moving. I hope it forwarded your kind of appreciation of jazz. And I certainly appreciate Aidan coming out and playing. It's just a really great collaboration. You've heard Aidan before. Aidan actually played several weeks ago with Bobby Salvaggio in a very unusual concert where there was no piano, there was no drums, there was no harmonic nature except what the two of them could, you know, put together on instruments not normally noted for, you know, harmonic structure, like the piano or the vibes of the guitar. So we're going to end with a tune. Well, all right, so now we're into the 1970s. Remember, so we're going to end in 1975. And the reason why we're going to end in 1975 is because that famous Miles Davis quote, in 1975, Miles Davis said, "Jazz is dead." This is Miles Davis, okay? One of the foremost players and supporters of jazz in history, actually. And he said, yeah, jazz is dead. And of course, that was also part of the time, remember on the cover of Time magazine when it said, "God is dead," okay? So a lot of people, that sparked, of course, jazz wasn't dead, it was just doing something else. As Aidan pointed out, it was just going on to the next thing. It was doing the next innovative thing, and some people called that jazz and some people didn't. Well, this is not new. The Cool School, when the Cool School came out, a lot of people, Vince Guaraldi, right, who did the Peanuts things, they said, "Oh, that's not jazz, that's not, no, he's sold out, that's commercial," you know. So there's been, all throughout the history of jazz, there has been people who said, "Oh, that's not jazz, this is it and this is not." I prefer Aidan's approach, where it's a multicultural, multi-level, multivalent experience where people can, you know, if it's jazz to you, it's jazz, right? A lot of people think, you know, Bob James is not jazz. Well, to a lot of people, Bob James is jazz, and it's the jazz they really, really like. And they don't like Coltrane, or they don't like, you know, late Miles, for example. So we get into the fusion era in the 1970s, and that's when I was in college, and all of these great bands came out. You know, Weather Report had Heavy Weather, Chick Corea came out with Return to Forever, Al Di Meola, Herbie Hancock with Chameleon in 1973, Stanley Clarke, Miles Davis, of course, he weighs in it seems like every decade he weighs in with something cool. Bitches Brew was in the 70s. The Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin. I mean, it was, and then that whole era, also the prog rock with Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and groups like that, King Crimson. And on the rock side, it also was influenced by jazz. So I think jazz, rather than being dead, it was so diversified that it was in so many other places that you could find jazz almost everywhere. We're going to end with a great piece, just a little snippet of a tune by Chick Corea. Chick Corea was a wonderful pianist and did a lot of really cool things in the 70s and 80s. In fact, my son and I just heard him with the electric band. After 20 years they hadn't played, and they came back and did a tour. They were amazing, of course. Incredible musicians, incredible writers. In fact, I just saw on YouTube, so it must be true, that he has a new book coming out on how to play what he plays and why he did what he did. And of course, people for decades have been wondering about Chick Corea's music because it was very complicated. So who knows? Maybe he will come out and explain it to all of us novices. Anyway, one more tune for you. Thanks for coming out. Please donate to a really great cause. This is our Quarantunes. Oh, by the way, next week we have a very special guest who is really not a guest at all. She actually is the organist here, and Aidan Plank's wife, Charlotte Plank, who is a wonderful, wonderful organist on this organ, which you cannot currently see because it's behind this huge white curtain. But behind this white curtain is not the Wizard of Oz. In fact, it's $1 million pipe organ, and she knows how to play it. And so there's going to be, for a Memorial Day weekend, there will be American music, trumpet, Chuck Rickard on trumpet, and organ with Charlotte Plank. And then Helen Welsh will finish up our May Quarantunes concerts with her pianist, Joe Lehman, and that will be the sort of that for May. So that's your kind of timetable for the next couple of weeks. So come join us, please, 7 o'clock Friday nights, right here. The beautiful Aragon Ballroom, wait, no, here at the First Congregational Church of Hudson. Unresolved again. Thank you very much. Good night.